Independent Senator Nick Xenophon certainly divided opinion the other night when he used the upper house to name an Adelaide priest accused of rape. Now the Council for Civil Liberties has accused him of abusing that parliamentary privilege. Council President Terry O'Gorman wants his complaint referred to the Senate's Privileges Committee. And if it's upheld, he believes the MP should apologise to the priest for damaging his reputation. John, what do you make of the use of parliamentary privilege in this way?
Well, I don't like it. I think these cases should go to the police. They should go to the authorities. It's interesting looking back at cases where parliamentary privilege has been used. Bill Heffernan's an example in New South Wales, Franca Arena. When they've got it wrong, their reputations are damaged almost irreparably.
Deirdre Gruisevin, you could add to that list.
Yes.
But there are other cases where it's worked in the same sort of history, aren't there, John?
Well,
John Hatton named a number of criminals in the lead up to the New South Wales Police Royal Commission. Isn't there room for that sort of
there is. There's definitely.
So where do you draw the line? Because it seems that the naming of suspected pedophiles or sex abusers is where people have come undone in the past. What is it about that issue?
Yeah, well, in the cases that we've talked about where the reputations have been introduced, the allegations were found to have been, in one case, made up. In other cases, they were wrong. In the cases that John Hatton raised, he was right. He was trying to ride over defamation laws at a time, remember, in New South Wales, when the New South Wales Police were conducting illegal phone taps because they felt they couldn't break through the red tape that was preventing them catching crooks.
So where do you draw the line? Because Rhys, Muldoon, here's a similar thing. The institution isn't acting. I mean, the New South Wales Police were hiding behind a single rotten apple theory in the barrel at that stage. Here you've got the Catholic Church. Nick Xenophon says all he wanted to extract was a suspension, essentially, of this person.
Oh, well, whatever whatever he was trying to achieve is one thing. I mean, I'm incredibly torn on this entire topic because while I disagree with Xenophon using parliamentary privilege fast and loose, and I think legally it's on it doesn't feel right, because society and the law and justice and all that sort of stuff should not run like that. But then I also have some sympathy for his frustration and some sympathy for victims of child abuse, particularly within a church where, of course, or like in the army or any institution where they want to keep it in-house, but then at some point, of course, the law has to be involved. Because when it's a law, it doesn't matter whether it's a church or an army or whatever, that law, when it's been broken, has to come to light and has to be dealt with. So while I have a lot of sympathy for his frustration and understand why he did it, I'm sort of legally, I find it troubling. So I'm completely on the fence with it.
We'll come back to the process of the law and church investigations later on in the show, but Chris Berg, on the issue of straight-out civil liberties, does parliamentary privilege run over civil liberties in this case, and should the Senate Privileges Committee uphold this complaint?
Listen, I think it's really obnoxious, and I think he's really abused privileges, but I think that he should apologise, but I'm not convinced that he should be forced to do so. I just think he's abused the system rather than, broken it in a way. Oh, the really obvious thing here, as far as I can tell, Nick Xenophon hasn't demonstrated that these were extreme circumstances where he needed to do a run around the legal system, and that's what concerns me most, and I think that's what sits very poorly with most observers here.
Well, when Senator Nick Xenophon did name a priest accused of sexual abuse in Parliament this week, he blamed the slow response by the South Australian Catholic Church in dealing with the issue. By way of contrast, he praised the Victorian approach, saying the system known as the Melbourne Process is a better way to deal with allegations against clergy. But now there are calls for a state government review of that system after the ABC's AM program highlighted the case of a woman who claimed she was raped by a priest but was refused access to compensation because she went to the police. Senator Xenophon has offered to help her.
The woman was told she could not access compensation if she went to the police. These are serious matters, and I'm disappointed if that is the case. If that woman wishes to contact my office here in Canberra, I'd be more than happy to speak with her and to advocate on her behalf. But I think what it does still contrast, though, is that however imperfect the Melbourne process has been, it was still in leaps and bounds more satisfactory for Archbishop Hepworth and for others compared to what has occurred in Adelaide.
Well, in some breaking news, what has occurred in Adelaide has changed because one of Nick Xenophon's demands was that the man chosen by the federal government to head its Mental Health Commission not take up that position because he was Monsignor David Capo, who was investigating the claim at the centre of that Senate naming. He has now decided not to take up the position at the head of the new Mental Health Commission, so he has achieved some results there. But to the Melbourne example, and Pam Kristic is a former Catholic school teacher who left the system over concerns of child safety. She now works for the advocacy group In Good Faith. And Pam Kristic joins us from Melbourne. Pam, welcome.
Thank you very
Can I ask, what was your response when Nick Xenophon praised the Melbourne Response, which is the name of the process used in Melbourne to deal with the victims' claims, as against the example in Adelaide?
I was concerned because I know that the case is that there are many problems with the Melbourne process. The difficulty is Nick's listening to one particular story, and there are so many. And in this particular story, the two Melbourne offenders were notorious serial offenders who were well known already to the Melbourne process. So there wasn't any question that the allegations were true. And they were dead. So that makes an enormous difference. But we've had many victims who've gone to the Melbourne process, like the Archbishop in Adelaide, where the offender, or the alleged offender, is still in a parish or still working, still with vulnerable people, and the process has been very, very slow and inadequate, and consequently the victims have suffered terribly because of it.
So the Senator expressed some surprise again today at the claims made on AM by a woman who said that as a result of her going to the police, her involvement in the Melbourne response was stopped. Were you at all surprised by that happening?
No, not at all. That's the standard procedure, and it's the reason, I believe it's the reason why many people choose to go to the church and not go to the police. Technically, she will be able to go for some compensation after the police case is over, but they need support. These victims need support during the disclosure process, and they are often really, really struggling with their life. The abuse has enormous effects on their life, and by the time they reach the point when they want to talk about it, they are really suffering huge social problems often, and they need support. And in this particular case, the lady is giving the information to the police, and so she's not entitled to anything from the Melbourne Response.
So you're saying that this is the standard and published process of the Melbourne Response. If you go to the police,
right,
any involvement with the church's process stops dead. The church says that's to protect the integrity of any police investigation or prosecution. Do you think that's the church's motivation? You seem to be suggesting it's to make sure they go to the church, not to the police.
Well, whatever their motivation, the effect on victims is the same. The bottom line is the church is supposed to be an organisation that is acting in a Christian manner, and these victims are being left high and dry without the care and support that they really ought to be getting. And really the legal response of the church and the way people are reacting at the moment about this case, the Xenophon case, is always the alleged offenders' rights are above the vulnerable people who've been harmed, or vulnerable people who might still be harmed by them still being in their position. So it often comes down to this point that the alleged offender has rights and the vulnerable people don't.
The Age, not so long ago, Pam, produced figures which they said they deduced from the church that there had been 300 cases under the Melbourne Response involving 100 priests, and this is over 15 years, and only one priest had been defrocked. Does that reflect your understanding of how the situation has worked?
Absolutely. Our group has been lobbying for a long time for priests who have been found to be offenders to be defrocked, and finally, after lots of demonstrations and all sorts of protests and letters sent to various people and pressure, they did start to defrock a few of the priests quite recently. But certainly that was the case when we went to The Age and the information was published. That was the case. Only one had been defrocked.
Rhys.
Pam, it's a slightly broader philosophical question. Why do you think that the church has so much trouble with uncomfortable truths? And let me just continue this sentence just slightly. In that surely that the whole point of God and the church and the Bible is seeking of truth. And that there will be enemies of truth and there will be difficulties with truth. Surely, I still don't quite in my heart understand why the church has trouble with difficult truths.
I absolutely agree with you. I was a teacher in Catholic schools for 20 years, and I thought that the organisation I work for was based on those Christian values. And of course, the truth will set you free. But I think what we have to understand is the Catholic Church is a closed community. It's a community that's trying to protect itself. And if you find yourself on the outside of that, if you're vulnerable and anything you have to say is uncomfortable, they'll close ranks against you. And unfortunately, they're being advised by lawyers, insurance people, they're advised by PR people, and they're not really listening to the true spiritual leaders that they should. I might add there are many, many priests who also want to have an independent inquiry into the Melbourne response.
There's also been there are also protections of the law as well. There was crossbench action in New South Wales last night too. The Greens MP David Shoebridge called for the overturning by law of the effects of what's known as the Ellis case, effectively a case brought by a victim, John Ellis, who found set up the legal precedent that there wasn't really a Catholic Church to sue. Here's a little bit of what David Shoebridge had to say.
The outcome is that in respect of child abuse dating back 20 or 30 years, the Catholic Church knows when dealing with victims that it has a complete defence.
Well, the Australian Lawyers Alliance said that there needs to be legislative change to hold the Catholic Church accountable for its pedophiles. What does this mean, Pam, this Ellis defence? Does it need to be overturned by parliaments?
Absolutely it does. Basically the church is completely protected. It actually only exists to own property and it can't be sued for the actions of its priests. Any organisation that has employees, and they don't consider their priests to be employees, is responsible for what they do to children and vulnerable adults. But the Catholic Church is completely immune from that. So definitely there needs to be laws changed.
Do you have any indication that parliaments are looking at changing the laws to allow the church to be sued?
I was told by a lawyer earlier in the year that they were looking at it in New South Wales and that there were a few lawyers pushing for it here in Melbourne. I haven't heard anything since then, but I sincerely hope that it is. That was before the change of government too, so I'm not quite sure where it stands now. But that's certainly something worth following up, because if you think about what's happened in the US, it's really only litigation that has led to change in the church. Here we're barred from that, and that's why so many people have to go through the Melbourne process, because there really isn't any other alternative apart from going to the police, and that is a very difficult process for victims of clergy sexual abuse, and many of them are not ready for it when they first disclose. But private litigation is a little bit easier because there's more privacy in it, and if that's what they're able to do in the US, we should be able to do that here, and the church should be accountable for what it does.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you, Pam. Now, obviously, when it's something so dark, when it's such a, such a grim topic and so dark and so sort of wicked, the light clearly has to be very strong. The brightness of that light has to really be very strong to break that darkness. And there's all those filters when you're going sort of, there's the police, there's the church, there's all these little filters and sort of gauzes to get down to the thing. Where do you think it has to go? Like, how do you do it without... how do you sort of keep that light shining on darkness without it diffusing?
It's very difficult, but all around the world now there have been government inquiries which have really seemed to get to the bottom of what's going on, and there have been some really good changes happening overseas. We really are a long way behind here in Australia, largely because the church has been good with its spin in saying that their processes here are good. But if they're so good, they should be willing to let that light shine on them and show how they operate. But I don't see how anything short of a government inquiry can shine that light bright enough. And it's great that victims are able to come forward and talk about their experiences to the press. It gets publicity, and maybe then the general public will help victims in their fight for justice. But they shouldn't have to air all of this in the press and have people discussing.
Thank you very much, Pam Kristic, for joining us from Melbourne, for your time. And that's all from all of us at The Drum. Thanks to our panel, Rhys, Muldoon, John Stanley and Chris Berg.